Welcome to a brand new wave, drowning out the noise that's tame. Liberty whispers through the brave, breaking free from every chain. Nullify the rules they crave, crypto beats that pave the way. Anarchy with minds that's safe, algorithms new dawn today. Out of bounds and out of sight, building futures pure and bright. Escape the grip and win the fight. Welcome into the legacy ride. Beyond control we take a stand, casting off the iron brand. Freedom flowing through our hands, revolution's our command. Decentralize the way we plan, all together we expand. Breaking shackles for the clan, in this journey we're unpanned. Out of bounds and out of sight, building futures pure and bright. Escape the grip and win the fight. Welcome into the legacy ride.
I am the legacy of Jennifer Kaiser, and this is another edition of Legacy News, episode 56, coming at you in just a moment.
As I tap into the rage of my inner life, understanding this journey we call life. It's jihad, struggle with my own drive, and I fight to contain my sanctity in a world leveled in unrealistic insanity.
It's unrealistic insanity. Somebody stop it. Ah! Welcome in to Legacy Right, Legacy News and Crypto Wednesday. I'm Andrew Joseph. And I like to add you to the program, Legacy Zach. Oh yeah, he's shy now. Don't listen to him. It's crazy.
It's another hit or a miss. As always I fail, so I quit. Drop one last cast.
We're gonna do this with music in the background this whole entire episode.
Oh yeah?
Can you hear that, Andrew? Can you all hear that?
I can until I turn the headphones off.
To you. Welcome in to Crypto Wednesday. So, this is Andrew Joseph. As always, I am
Hey, guys.
Zachary Kaiser. So, and we're moving along actually. About ready to jump into Breaking Monero, probably the shortest episode that you're gonna watch with us today. Episode 12, right? Or is this 13? I forget.
Oh man. Hold on just a second, I'll tell you. This is episode 12.
Episode 12. Like I
Revenge of the
said, probably-
Revenge of the 13th is actually the shortest. It's only 6 minutes and 41 seconds.
Interesting. So that's episode 13 then. Yeah. So I foreshadowed. So this isn't the shortest one, everybody. But it is relatively short compared to the last couple episodes that we've done for Breaking Monero. With that, should we just dive right into it? Or Or should
I
we
go in
just
for the
should we just have Andrew dance?
Why are we watching this podcast again? I don't know. It's so stupid. But you know what isn't? Breaking Monero. Let's go on, ladies and gentlemen. Time to break the Monero.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of Breaking Monero. Today, Sarang and I will be talking about the input-output structure of Monero transactions. When you send Monero transactions, you reveal to the rest of the network how many inputs and how many outputs are sent in the transaction. You can think of outputs like dollar bills. Some people call them notes, where they're just a container of money. I sometimes call them bags of gold because you can sort of have a varying amount of gold in there that you dump into other bags. So that's what an output is. But when you send Monero transactions, you may reveal a good amount of information with this metadata. So today, we're going to talk about some considerations when you send transactions to help make sure that this metadata alone can't severely undermine the privacy of your transactions. But first, we're going to have Sarang talk about what the different transaction example types that you can make in Monero, what the metadata on the number of inputs and outputs reveal, and then also talk about whether this is unique to Monero or not.
Sure. So like you were saying, the idea is that a transaction has one or more inputs and then one or more outputs. Inputs are spent in their entirety and generate outputs that could go to different destinations or the same destination. And of course, this is not unique to Monero. This kind of structure of consuming inputs and generating outputs is the way Bitcoin and its family of different assets, similar asset types works. Monero uses it, of course. Even other privacy-focused assets like Zcash now use a similar structure, albeit applied in a bit of a different way. And of course, the number of inputs and outputs you have depends in part on what you're trying to do. So as you're going to see later, most commonly, you typically consume one, maybe two inputs, depending on the total hidden value contained in those. And typically, you'll often have one destination output and then one other output where the change, the remaining balance, is sent back to you. And of course, this is all still protected by the idea of Monero's stealth addresses. And of course, each of the inputs that you spend is still obscured by its own separate ring of decoys in a ring signature, which we talked about. There are kind of some big exceptions to this. So one big example is the idea of pool payouts. So pool payouts are often sending a fixed amount of Monero to a bunch of different recipients in their pool. So oftentimes these will have many different outputs. Monero currently, because of the way that Bulletproofs works, has a limit of 16 outputs, for example. But you'll often see this, and if you do, you might be able to surmise that it's a pool payout. Another thing you might try to do is what's called a churn. In a churn, you basically send funds to yourself, which may be an attempt to kind of obscure the fact that funds you've received are then going to be used for a later purpose, although it's a bit tricky to do this correctly. And oftentimes, those might consume a single input and then generate, ideally two outputs, one to yourself and one to change. It's worth noting, and we're going to talk a little bit about this later too, that by default, Monero will always have at least two outputs. Just because most transactions use two anyway, destination and change, and we don't want to reveal information that would be caused by sending a single output, which could, under certain circumstances, reveal information about that output, and could also signal to an adversary that a churn operation where you're just sending to yourself and nowhere else might be in progress.
Yeah, so adding on to the one output considerations, as you mentioned, the Monero software will not allow users to send transactions with only one output for several reasons. So first, if the user was trying to do a churn type transaction to send funds to themselves, it often would look like the case where they have one input and one output, where users are sending the entire value of the output to themselves. And that ultimately is the issue with one output transactions, is that that the entire value of all the inputs, whether it's one input or 5 inputs or 10 inputs or however many number of inputs, is all sent to one output. It's all sent to one recipient. And so that the entire value of all these outputs is spent. by making it so that there are at least 2 outputs, you might still spend the entire value of all these inputs to one individual, but it then also fits in with all the other transactions that have change. So even if you don't have change, by having a 2 output minimum, even if one is empty, it's a 0 input, a 0 output, then you're able to hide among the other normal transactions that have change. So it helps hide certain things like churn transactions. It also helps make sure that transactions look, in general, more homogeneous. So with Monero, the wallet minimum is with 2 outputs, which is really necessary to prevent people from knowing that the entire value of all the inputs is actually used up in that transaction, not that some of it is returned as change. And that's a really important distinction. So we just want to also stress that even if certain cryptocurrency implementations have really, really strong privacy otherwise, this is generally a piece of metadata that is revealed even in these really, really good implementations or otherwise really good implementations. So with Monero, if you can assume, like, what if Monero had perfect ring signature privacy? What if we had enormously large ring sizes? You would still know the number of inputs and the number of outputs that were sent in a transaction. So you still might infer, okay, well, this transaction still likely is a pool payout or an exchange with batch withdraw because they pay 16 people, and it's not typical user behavior to pay 16 people at a time. So those sort of things are important for many implementations, not just Monero, but also other privacy implementations like Zcash, where they might have otherwise really good privacy properties, but this metadata is often usually leaked to others. So Sarang, is there anything else you want to cover on this point before I move to showing some of the data in regards to how people have spent Monero related to the number of inputs and outputs in the past?
Yeah, I mean, you did say that, you know, one of the things we'd ideally like to do is try to make all transactions look as similar as possible from a metadata perspective. So, you know, if every single transaction were 2 input, 2 output, or something like that, you might say, well, that's great. You know, all the transactions look pretty similar from that respect. So, you know, that must mean that, you know, privacy is improved. And from a certain perspective, you know, that is true. You know, the way that I like to look at this is kind of like how Monero used to allow basically any ring size you want, down to some minimum. If you wanted a very large ring size, you could do that. But, you know, even after we chose to standardize on a fixed ring size, which is 11 right now. So every ring for any input that's spent must contain 11 total input, 11 total ring members. Even with that, that does not automatically mean that because that part of transactions was homogenized, that solved all of the privacy woes that folks might have had. You know, it's one aspect to transaction metadata. Fixing it is not necessarily sufficient to solve, you know, all the particular privacy-based use cases folks have. And this is another example of that. So we'd like to homogenize things as much as possible, but of course we know that it's not necessarily enough. And it's also worth noting with the idea of like 1 output transactions, mathematically, if we did allow those, you know, it might be possible for me to send Justin a transaction with 1 output, and then for Justin to send me a transaction back with 1 output. And under certain circumstances like that, there is actually additional data that could be leaked. So, you know, besides the fact that it would also say that the entire value of the output was sent to Justin, there's other concerns too. So we like to require at least 2 outputs, either within the wallet software or maybe eventually as a consensus rule.
Yeah, that's a really good point. The number of inputs and number of outputs is an important consideration, but it certainly is not the only consideration. So you still need to worry about things like the general strength of your ring signature, also timing analysis, everything else we've talked about in previous episodes. Those don't go away just because you're following these best practices. It's just one additional set of best practices you should add to the rest of the pile. One other thing I want to add quickly before moving on is that it's often the case that people will try to look at several transactions in a row that meet a specific payout structure. So if we look at things like mining pools are sort of a mediocre example because, as we mentioned in a previous episode, they often make data public. Well, let's suppose that we're talking about a private mining pool that keeps things in-house. They don't share this information with others. Well, with these private mining pools, they typically will make these 16 output transactions continuously. So it often is the case that a mining pool will pay out 15 people, have one output as change back themselves, and then they'll use that output in another 16 out transaction going into the future. So you can sort of look at the outputs that are generated by the pool and say, okay, well, I know that the change to the pool most likely will be spent in another 16 output transactions. So I'm going to specifically look for transactions that meet this metadata, or say that, yes, I'm looking for transactions in the future that have 16 outputs. And by doing so, it can help reduce the anonymity set further. This is an example of a heuristic you could use to learn more information about users. This also could be the case with churning, where let's say for some reason you might suspect that a user might churn 8 times, let's say. You need some way to come up with this information in the first place, of course, but let's say due to some knowledge of information, you know they will churn 8 times. Well, you might look for a path of 1 in, 2 out transactions 8 times, and if there might not be thousands of routes that look like that, there might only be a dozen or so. So now your anonymity set is lower because someone has knowledge of how you're trying to transact, and this metadata could be used to learn more information. So it's also not just the case on a per transaction basis. It also matters if someone has a good understanding what your general spending behaviors are. They can use this metadata to facilitate some other investigations. So other interesting things to do with metadata analysis. Really, in Monero, generally, if you have predictable repeated behavior, it's generally a problem. And this metadata that is leaked based off the number of inputs and outputs is another thing to worry about in terms of trying to avoid this sort of predictable behavior. So I'm going to share my screen here and show some of the information that was collected based off Monero transaction history. So I have an Excel document pulled up here. This is information prepared by the Nonsense Research Lab, headed up by Isthmus and a few others. And it showed, they scanned the Monero blockchain. For this data, it's specifically related to ring CT outputs only. So they have information on all outputs, but these are just outputs created 2017 and later. It does not include Monero's early outputs. And we can see the distribution of inputs, the distribution of outputs, and they also looked at the number of one output transactions. And so we'll look at all of those very briefly. So you can see here, there are that about 49% of Monero transactions have one input and 41% have 2 inputs. Only about 9% of transactions have any other number. The maximum output, at least as the maximum number of inputs, at least at the time that they prepared this data, was 1,187. So just a fun fact for you there. There was at least one transaction with a large number of inputs. So the key takeaway from this is, if you are sending a transaction with more than 2 inputs, you are at least falling slightly out of the typical zone. If you're sending a transaction with only 1 or 2 inputs, you're generally, at least you have a pretty big crowd to hide in. Of course, I mentioned that it matters more for other transactions you make too, but in general, for one given transaction, it's pretty typical to see those with 1 and 2 inputs. If you make a transaction with, let's say, 77 inputs, there are only 100 transactions in Monero's recent history that had this, so it's much less frequent. And if you go down where there's only, let's say, 5 transactions with 193 inputs, then you might be a little bit more revealing compared to how you otherwise might look. So that's just one thing to keep in mind. Most people spend transactions with only 1 or 2 inputs in Monero. If you look at the outputs, it's even more stark. You can see here's just sorted by the number. This is sorted by the total transaction count over here. 91% of Monero transactions have 2 outputs. Again, ring CT transactions. So you can see there is an extraordinary skew here where 2 outputs is vastly overrepresented compared to any other number. I also highlighted 16 here. Again, this is the maximum amount that you can spend with bulletproofs. Any of these higher numbers were spent before bulletproofs. But you can see there's only 13,703 transactions, again, as the time this was written, that sent the maximum amount, which would suggest that if you look at a 16 output transaction, there's a really good chance that it's related to an exchange or pool payout. So that helps you, as an investigator, learn a little bit more about the Monero blockchain there too. Now, this is something that's really annoying, is that there are 2,522 transactions with only one output. So as I mentioned, the Monero wallet software will not let you send these transactions. So that means that these 2,522 transactions were sent with some custom wallet that someone created and was able to mine these or have them confirmed in the blocks. So this is something that, I mean, going into the future, Sarang and I recommend that this should be a consensus requirement, that these are not allowed at all. But as of right now, there are 2,522 of them. We can actually look at the distribution of them. So these are all of them here. These are all the transaction outputs. All this information is available publicly on their GitHub. I'll have a link in the description. And we can look at a histogram here. So you can see that not too many were created before April 2018, but through April, May, going through July, that's when the vast majority of these one output transactions were created. Around October 2018, there were fewer of them created, and as a result, it looks like someone was really trying to test it around this time period. There was a Monero fork around this time period, so it's sort of interesting if you're trying to investigate the Monero blockchain to help see what people were doing over these time periods. These one output transactions certainly help share a little bit there. So that's just one thing that I found was pretty interesting, that the Nonsensus Research, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, research lab put together, looking at the distribution of Monero inputs and outputs. It can be really useful to help give you a really basic understanding of whether what you're doing is common among Monero network participants or not. And this may change over time. For example, you can't send transactions with outputs greater than 16 at this point. So the proportion of those with more than 16 outputs is decreasing over time, for instance. But it's just a really good way to look at how people are generally spending the funds. So, Sarang, can you talk a little bit more about what this metadata means to people, how they should really be concerned about sending these transactions with either a normal amount of inputs and outputs or a very unusual amount of inputs and outputs?
Right. So, typical transactions, as we've seen, are almost always one or two inputs and then kind of the minimum of two outputs. The number of inputs can change, of course, depending on the types of funds that you're trying to send. Of course, in any given transaction, you need to have enough funds in the combined outputs you're spending in order to make the transaction balance. So there might be circumstances when you just have little bits of change left over that, do need to be pulled into a given transaction, which could increase the number of inputs. So, if at all possible, by using kind of standard wallet software, the wallet will often try to make kind of reasonable and smart decisions about how to set up transactions in this way. And of course, for example, require two or more outputs to avoid the issue where that all of the inputs have been spent, for example. But even if you're very, very careful about always having a reasonable number of inputs and outputs, so your transaction can kind of hide in the crowd, as we said, like certain types of predictable behavior could make you stand out. So if an adversary happens to know that the software you're using or that your own behavior often leads to you churning a certain number of times, that might imply a certain kind of structure to your transactions that the adversary might try to look at in this big, broad Monero transaction graph, which basically reduces the size of the crowd that you get to hide in. So, ideally, spending behavior should be as similar to kind of the crowd as possible and should ideally be as unpredictable as possible.
All right, thanks. Besides those two things, are there any other recommendations you have for users?
For a lot of, I would say for most, kind of different threat and use case models, using standard Monero software as usual, is typically, a reasonable way to do things. If you are concerned about kind of targeted analysis toward you, you might want to be very careful about, as we said, many different types of metadata, which could involve things like, sending transactions around the same times or, from the same IP address every time, or, making sure that you're not using custom wallet software that might try to make poor decisions, or, to look out for, very common repeated churn behavior that always looks the same, for example.
All right, thanks, Rang. Is there anything else you want to leave the listener with?
I guess just that, this is one particular kind of metadata that is absolutely not unique to Monero. But it's something interesting to think about, right? It's a type of metadata that is very difficult for us to homogenize. Ring size is very easy to mandate. We just say that that's a system parameter. But the reason that most digital assets like Monero and others have fixed input-output structures is that that particular kind of metadata is very, very difficult to hide in a smart way. And attempts to try to make transactions more homogeneous could lead to behavior like very regular, repeated, predictable churn, which itself can leave a fingerprint. So for many threat models and use cases, just kind of standard use of the default Monero wallet client is just fine.
All right. Thank you so much, Sarang, for joining me today. Thanks, everyone, for watching this episode of Breaking Monero. Catch you in the next one.
If you're sitting around Googling how to make money on the internet and
Welcome back.
Harambe.
Welcome back. I hope that was an interesting one. I actually went onto their GitHub, linked in the description, and I found an issues page that I actually kind of want to go over one of the messages. So
sure, I can
and
certainly
with
try to
that-
do what I can't guarantee anything. I'm not a programmer. I'm just kind of an enthusiast.
So you're a retard.
I mean, hey,
But BG
I'm up for
Goodell
retard of the year.
says, BG Goodell says March 15th of 2019, back when this most likely came out, obviously since the coding got posted up onto GitHub, says using the data posted here originally, assuming number of inputs and number of outputs per transaction on IID random variables drawn from a negative binomial distribution, the method of moments for parameter estimation reveals the following. 1, number of inputs in NB RP with R equals 71.900 and P equaling 70 thousandths approximately. 2, number of outputs is MBRP with R equals 38 and 697 thousandths and P equals 137 thousandths approximately. However, ring CT presumably has impacted these numbers significantly. The values may be different if we divide the data set into two pieces, pre-RCT and post-RCT. What does that mean? What exactly does that mean? And what is this pre and post RCT that he speaks of?
I mean, listen, this is next level stuff that I'm honestly not comfortable answering because I know I'm gonna look like an idiot. The closest thing I can think of in engineering sense is, in video game architectures, they calculate for like flow points and stuff like that, and for rendering stuff. So that's probably the closest thing I can think of that's even associated with something like this. They're trying to calculate. It's like trying to stick a landing.
Well, here's another one. Just your perspective. You don't have to be right or anything. I mean, this is a lame speak podcast, all right? So we're not experts here. I mean, you haven't been there, have you?
No,
you haven't been
I don't
there.
think so.
I mean, you have to be actually inside the code in order to be an expert, Andrew.
Right.
So,
I mean,
but
wait.
no, go ahead.
I'm not writing in binary, so you'll have to forgive me. I can't answer.
No.
And see.
Another one that he labels is, it occurs to me that this data set would be a good candidate for poison random variables too, for which the MLE is easily computable with the sample mean, better than method of moments in any respects. What is poison random variables?
Well, I mean, in a business sense, poison could be like a poison pill, right? Is that you don't want something to happen, so you implement a way to deflect a certain action from occurring. So that might be what they're talking about. And the E, I'm just making a guess here, an educated guess, is the engine, like the Ethereum has an engine in a virtual sense for them to operate things on.
Hold on. This is what Wikipedia says. Poisson distribution. So in probability theory and statistics, the Poisson distribution is a discrete probability distribution that expresses the probability of a given number of events occurring in a fixed interval of time if these events occur with a known constant mean rate and independent of the time since the last event, which it kind of explains Monero on that level of how it operates. Or how they want it to operate or not operate.
Well, I
So
can imagine it's like the poison pill thing I was talking about earlier. It's assessing risk and trying to manage it as effectively as possible. In computer engineering, specifically in emulation, there's different types of emulation that you could do. There's high level emulation, which for every positive and negative, they directly interact and answer each other and translate each other on every call. And there's low level emulation, which is basically, interpreting large sets of information and calculating it at a slower rate.
all right. So number of inputs per TXN sample mean 5.41. Number of outputs per TXN sample mean 6.
Transaction.
So yeah,
TXN is transaction.
Whatever. So if we are to model inputs and outputs this way, we could use Poisson 5.41 and Poisson 614 to model the inputs and outputs respectively. However, this is not a good choice for this data. The Poisson distribution will have a mode of floor, lambda, and a median that isn't too dissimilar for values of lambda near around 5 to 6 as above. For the same reason, the negative binomial distribution above is not a good choice either. For more robust but not max likelihood estimates, the medians can be used instead 1 in, 2 out. And then he crossed out something else. Eyeballing the log of the histogram, these data appear non-Poisson. Negative binomial seems more likely. I'm using that for a modeling for now, but goodness of fit tests are in order next. So for BG, what's your perspective on what he's trying to convolute there?
Well, it does sound like that he's trying to set up different, prerequisites in cases of like nomad capitalist called a black swan event, right? Unanticipated occurrence. He's trying to anticipate when something is to happen that's unexpected and it causes chain split, as they talk about earlier in the series, and how to effectively manage it and maintain the security of the blockchain for Monero.
So, going off of that and the video in itself, what do we gather from the information provided here?
Well, I mean, the video was about inputs and outputs, which is basically, like I said, it's the binary. It's 1 and 0. It's the main language of how a computer operates. The CPU processes the information. Every byte is just an electrical signal, and it builds up from there. And they make it a lot easier because they use these specialized computer programming languages that like basically feed the machine and tell them how to interpret the code and to send the electrical signals. And so that's what they're talking about here in these questions that you asked. As for metadata, a good information way to explain that what metadata is this: if you have a picture that you take on your phone, right, and you put it on the computer, it's going to have information about the GPS location, the time, the type of picture, the quality of the camera. That's something that's was automatically built into the photo, and that's what they're talking about in the metadata for Monero, is that they're trying to there's certain tail information about the transaction and what wallet data or what wallet you sent it from, and what time and stuff like that. And they're talking about trying to lower the quality of the information, so it's harder to it's harder for them to know who you are and to obfuscate it. You're on mute.
So what you're saying is crypto, just like in reality, there is no such thing as homosexuality. You can't be
Something
gay.
like that. Yeah.
So it's binary, two forms, input, output. You stick it in every. No, I'm just playing.
You put your left foot in, you put your right.
Yeah. But that's basically, so judging by what we discussed yesterday on yesterday's episode, crypto destroys the culture war.
I mean, it streamlines the processing of information, so it's a lot harder for you to divert. I mean, that's what they do. They game the system with the money, and that's what crypto is designed to do, is to not make it impossible for them to game the system. Because as soon as you get a foothold on one crypto token, something else comes out that's more effective, and you're basically, screwed. Oh, yes,
on.
I am retarded.
To finish out here, though, Andrew, why don't you go ahead and segue to your own promo, put Monero over, and tell us why Monero is the crypto exchange for the future.
Well, I mean, it's one implementation of the idea. This is open source Libra money. Libra is in left copy left. It's where people can go and provide a commit. No pressure if they don't feel like it's something that they're actually going to improve anything on. But it's still putting the idea out there for anybody to look at 20 years from now and say, hey, that was a good idea. And they can implement it in the way that they seem fit. So Monero is just that basic principle. And actually, there's a video I'd like to get through actually next week about the co-opting of the copyleft movement for political purposes. It's a little older video, but I think it'll definitely be informative for us.
Stop giving people hints. Let them guess. Next week is episode 13 of Breaking Monero.
Well, let's talk about the Tuesday episode, but that'll work.
But wouldn't the copy left? Shouldn't that be integrated into Crypto Wednesday?
It's a political video. It's a political video. It's not particularly. It's more about the open source community.
Yeah. Still Crypto Wednesday. Because we're talking about open source community adjustments towards the crypto universe with Monero.
Yeah, okay.
So, plus next week is a short video too. So, of course, knowing you, this video is probably 5 hours long.
You got to have the context and the details.
We're not watching a 5 hour long video on a short segmented show. So, I'm not going to be here all day.
Okay.
I don't think anybody else would want to be here all day when they can just go find the video themselves.
Yeah, okay.
But anyways, anything else to say, Andrew?
No, I think I'm pretty good. Thanks for watching, guys.
Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe. and help support us, share this content, and just get the information out to the world. And let's go on a free ride to the other side, because it's only free if you put the work into it, because nothing is actually free. So with that, live long and prosper. Andrew, I'm out of here. Why don't you go help that nice old man out there? He seems
What
lost.
old man? Sir? What are you doing here? He says he's looking for the door. Again. Oh no.
I'm going to have to leave now, but I was sure I came in by that door over there. Hey, man, where's the door to get out of here?
Oh, it's right over there, sir.
Right over where?
The exit sign? Exit sign? It's that door right there.
That red sign?
Yeah, just go right that way.
Okay.
I think it went down the wrong door.
Where am I? Hey, what the fuck's wrong with you? That's not the right door.
Sir, you're gonna want to go to the one with the exit. You went to the door to the side there.
I went to the right doors and where you pointed me to, you fuck.
I pointed you to the exit.
Man, you're fucking with the wrong guy.
I'm sorry.
You see this bulge on my hip? You know what that is?
That's a gun.
That's a Glock. You're fucking with the wrong guy.
Yeah.
Don't ever send me to the wrong